The fierce wind howls through the rigging as towering waves crash against weathered hulls, threatening to swallow the brave souls aboard. On these ships, tiny islands of wood adrift in endless, unforgiving oceans, men faced not only storms and treacherous currents, but also unimaginable hardships. Their spirits were tested by the salty spray that burned their eyes, the creaking of the aging planks under relentless strain, and the gnawing fear of the unknown. Amidst this chaos, they relied on courage, grit, and the hope of discovering new worlds. These sailors endured hunger, sickness, and despair, all for the chance to carve history on the high seas. Their stories are woven into the very fabric of colonial exploration, revealing a human saga of resilience against nature's fury. If you're captivated by these maritime tales, hit subscribe to reach 3,000 and join our voyage. Share where you're watching from, and let us know you're aboard with a quick emoji. You ever wonder what it might have been like to survive on a ship during the age of exploration? Imagine the howling winds, the relentless salt spray, and the icy touch of the ocean's breath against weathered wood. The sailors, packed tight in creaky caravels or massive galleons, faced not only the treacherous waters, but also the unthinkable diet of the time. Today, we're diving into that gritty world, specifically into 12 disgusting drinks colonial sailors drank just to keep going. Back then, ships were made primarily from oak or pine, carefully selected for their durability. Carpenters worked with hand tools, hammers, saws, and augers to shape the wood. These vessels weren't just big boxes, they were engineering marvels, built to withstand the fury of storms and long voyages across the uncharted seas. The hulls needed to be watertight, often sealed with tar or pitch, while the sails, stitched from heavy canvas, caught the wind to push explorers toward new worlds. Life aboard these ships was brutal. The hierarchy was strict. Captains ruled with an iron fist, while the master helmsmen and sailors had their roles carved out in routines that never really changed. Daylight hours meant endless labor, adjusting sails, repairing wood, and navigating with rudimentary tools like the astrolabe and compass, which weren't always reliable. Night brought little relief. Darkness with only lanterns swinging in the damp, salty air. Conditions were harsh. Freezing temperatures in the North Atlantic, scorching heat near the equator, and storms that could tear the ship apart in minutes. Disease spread fast, and sanitation was a joke. Think wet, rotting ropes, moldy bread, and water contaminated by the bilge. So, what kept these sailors alive? Food and drink mostly. But it wasn't pretty. The typical diet consisted of salted meat, hardtack, those nasty, brittle biscuits, and dried legumes. But water, that was a problem. It often turned sour quickly, becoming a breeding ground for bacteria. To stave off scurvy, a disease caused by vitamin C deficiency, sailors relied on what they could find or make do with, including some truly nasty drinks. Now let's talk about those drinks, because the sailors didn't exactly have a bar cart. The first was ship's water, which was often old, salty, and foul-smelling. You can forget about freshness here. It was a murky, briny liquid that could make you gag. To make it more palatable, or at least to mask the awful taste, they'd mix in various substances, including vinegar or even fermented liquids. The second was grog, a mixture of water, rum, and lime juice. Rum was cheap and abundant, produced from sugarcane plantations in the Caribbean. Drinking it helped fight off scurvy, but it also dulled the senses and could lead to drunken chaos on board. Imagine a creaking ship pitching wildly, sailors stumbling and shouting over the howling wind, clutching their mugs of sour, spiced liquid. Then there was beer, which, despite the long voyages, was sometimes brewed on ships from malted barley or other fermentable grains. But brewing and storing beer on a moving, damp vessel was no easy feat. It often turned sour or was contaminated by mold. Still, it was better than water, and many sailors looked forward to that small comfort. Another notorious drink, the sour milk or clabber, which was just milk that had gone bad, but was sometimes consumed out of desperation. And let's not forget fermented fruit juices, which often turned into alcoholic sludge after days or weeks in the sweltering hold. Now imagine the sensory nightmare: salty tang in your nose, the sharp sting of alcohol burning down your throat, the bitter taste of spoiled liquids. These drinks weren't just about hydration, They were about survival, even if it meant enduring misery sip after sip. On top of all that, the psychological toll was immense. Men faced loneliness, fear of storms or shipwreck, and the constant threat of disease. The alcohol helped numb that pain, though it often made the suffering worse when the effects wore off. It was a cruel cycle. Drink to forget, then wake up worse off. It's wild to think how these sailors endured such conditions, driven by the hope of discovering new lands or riches. Their resilience was tested daily, facing the storms, hunger, and the gut-wrenching taste of their liquid comforts. These drinks, as disgusting as they seem today, were their lifeline, and a testament to human endurance in the face of extreme hardship. So next time you crack open a cold beverage, remember those brave sailors. They navigated storms, treacherous waters, and their own despair, all while swallowing some of the nastiest drinks history has ever known. Imagine you're standing on the deck of a ship, miles away from the comfort of land. The sun beats down mercilessly, the salty wind bites at your skin, and you can feel the rough wood creaking beneath your feet. The air is thick, heavy with the stench of sweat, vomit and unwashed bodies. Your stomach churns, but there's nothing to vomit, just a bitter metallic taste in your mouth. You're cold one moment, then drenched in sweat the next. Your gums bleed, your teeth ache from the constant jarring of the deck. And this, my friend, is just a glimpse of what life was like for sailors during the age of exploration. Today we're going to dive into the gritty, often brutal world of colonial maritime history. We'll explore what it truly meant to sail these treacherous waters during the 15th to 18th centuries. I promise, if you're into stories of human endurance and survival, this will blow your mind. But first, if you enjoy this kind of deep dive into history's human side, hit that like button. And if you want to see more stories like this, subscribe and turn on notifications. Now let's set sail. The age of exploration was a time of dreams and discoveries. Ships like the Caravel, Galleon, and Carrack took to the seas, carrying brave men and women chasing wealth, new lands, and fame. But let's be honest, it wasn't all gold and glory. These ships were floating prisons, and their crews faced death every day. The mortality rate was staggering, often reaching 20% or more. Imagine losing 1 in 5 crew members during a single voyage. That's like a modern plane crash happening over and over every time they set sail. Most ships carried between 50 and 200 men. These were rough, hardened sailors, often young and eager, but also superstitious. Superstitions that could fill an ocean of stories. The voyage could last months. Food was scarce and spoiled quickly. Water turned foul, swarming with bacteria, mold, and insects. Imagine biting into bread that's hard, black, and crawling with maggots. That was common. They called it sea biscuit, but it was more like a dense, stale brick. And yet food was the least of their worries. The real killers lurked elsewhere, in the cold, in the disease, in the despair. Ships lacked proper sanitation. Feces and vomit piled up in the cramped quarters. The air was thick with the smell of salt, sweat, and death. Disease spread like wildfire. Dysentery, scurvy, typhus, and measles tore through crews. The mortality rate from illness alone was staggering. Now, imagine how they coped, or rather how they didn't. Bandages soaked in rum or vinegar were used to treat wounds, but infections often set in. Gums bleeding from scurvy gave sailors a look of hemorrhage, their teeth loose and falling out. It was an agonizing decline, both physically and mentally. Many sailors went insane, staring at endless horizons, clutching hope and despair in equal measure. And still, it gets worse. The ships were not just fragile, but deadly prisons. Crew members suffered from scurvy, caused by a severe lack of vitamin C. To combat this, some ships carried citrus fruits, but not always in enough quantity. The result? Gums bleeding, teeth falling out, weakness and hallucinations. Some sailors would curl up below deck, shaking uncontrollably, their bodies racked with pain. They could forget about modern medicine or antiseptics. Antibiotics were still centuries away. But it wasn't just sickness. The psychological toll was brutal. Imagine being confined on a tiny vessel with limited sunlight, constantly fighting storms, hunger, and fear. The sounds of creaking wood, the slap of waves, and the distant cries of gulls become a drowned-out background to your misery. Crew members fought among themselves, driven to madness or despair. Some tried to jump overboard, desperate to end the nightmare. Others simply gave up, staring at the endless horizon, waiting for death. And what about the ship itself? These vessels were built for speed and cargo capacity, not comfort or safety. They were made of wood, over 1,000 planks joined by nails and tar. Over time, the wood rotted, the nails rusted, and leaks became common. Constant patching, bailing water, and reinforcing the hulls was routine. Sometimes storms would tear the masts apart or flood the lower decks, drowning entire crews in seconds. Think of it as a floating hellscape where every day was a fight for survival. The sailors had their own survival techniques. They relied on tough routines, rationing food, rationing water, tying themselves to the ship during storms to avoid being washed overboard. They used makeshift tools, knives sharpened on grit, buckets for waste, and ropes for everything. When someone fell ill, they'd try to treat wounds with tar or herbs, if they had any left. Sometimes desperation led to dangerous remedies, bloodletting, leeching, or even applying hot stones to boils, anything to stave off death. And then there were the strange, unsettling rituals. Sailors believed in charms, prayers, and superstitions. They'd hang chains, cross themselves, or chant hymns. They'd toss coins into the sea for good luck. But the ocean was cruel and unpredictable. No charm could fully protect them from the cold, the storms, or the unyielding march of disease. Yet amid this chaos, some stories of resilience emerge, tales of sailors surviving months at sea, fighting off starvation, sickness, and despair. Stories of cargo ships carrying up to 2,000 trees from exotic lands, or crews that managed to build makeshift hospitals on deck. They learned to read the weather by the color of the sky, the feel of the wind, and the behavior of the waves. In a brutal way, these hardships forged a toughness that still echoes today. But don't forget, this was the reality for countless brave souls. Their sacrifices, their suffering, made possible the age of exploration. They faced the unknown with trembling hands and bleeding gums, often paying the highest price for discovery. So if you think about the modern cruise ships with their smooth rides, plush cabins, and onboard hospitals, try to imagine the brutal truth of those early voyages. These ships were prisons, battlegrounds, and coffins all at once. Their crews endured hell, often in silence, driven by hope or fear, sometimes both. If you want to get into the nitty-gritty of exactly how sailors fought to stay alive, the tools they used, the medicines they relied on, the routines they developed, I've got more stories to tell. Just stay tuned, because this is only the beginning. And remember, their suffering paved the way for the world we know today, built on courage that's hard to even imagine. Imagine yourself standing at the bow of a creaking wooden ship, hundreds of miles from land. The salty wind stings your eyes, and the cold, cruel ocean stretches infinitely before you. Life at sea during the colonial era was a constant battle against nature, disease, and your own body. But beyond the storms and starvation, sailors faced some truly bizarre and disgusting hardships. Today, I want to take you deeper into that world, into the strange, often revolting solutions sailors relied on, and the brutal reality of their day-to-day survival. Let's start with a problem that every sailor knew all too well: dehydration and contaminated drinking water. Imagine you're out for weeks, maybe months. Fresh water is scarce. The ocean water is salty and bitter, completely undrinkable. To make matters worse, what little fresh water they had often became stagnant, greenish, and foul-tasting. So sailors resorted to what they called barrels of rainwater, collected whenever the ship was under a breeze, or they'd boil seawater in makeshift cauldrons hoping to kill bacteria. But boiling wasn't always enough. Microbes, fungi, and mold took hold, sometimes causing sickness that spread faster than the ship's crew could fight it. Some ships relied on rudimentary filtration systems, sand, charcoal, even cloth, trying to reduce the impurities, but these were primitive and often ineffective. Now picture this: sailors with cracked, sunburned lips, their throats raw from dehydration, drinking contaminated water full of algae, mold, and even insect larvae. Yeah, larvae. That's right. Imagine biting into a piece of moldy bread, then adding that disgusting, slimy water. And this when the crew was already weakened by scurvy, dysentery, and starvation. It's no wonder that diseases like cholera and typhoid ravaged ships with terrifying speed. If anyone managed to survive the dehydration, they faced a new nightmare: the food itself. Food in those days wasn't pretty. Fresh supplies ran out fast. Preserved meat and hardtack, those stale, hard biscuits, became the only sustenance. But not everything was as it seems. These biscuits, packed with salt and preservatives, could last months. That's the good news. The bad: mold, weevils, and bacteria thrived in the dark. Sometimes sailors would find larvae crawling inside the hardtack, little worms wriggling in the salt and flour. The smell was enough to make you gag, a sour, rotten stench. They'd chew on these anyway, trying to keep alive, sometimes with bloodied gums and teeth falling out from scurvy. But it wasn't just mold and bugs. Imagine the horror of spoiled meat. Salted pork or beef could turn putrid after weeks on the open sea. If the meat wasn't properly cured or stored in leaky barrels, the kind that rotted and leaked, then bacteria took over. Sailors would sometimes have to eat rotten meat to survive, risking food poisoning or worse. And as if that wasn't enough, dehydration and poor nutrition left many sailors weak, trembling, and easy prey for disease. Even in the face of all this, sailors developed clever, if gruesome, survival tricks. They'd sometimes ferment fruits or vegetables in barrels, creating makeshift alcohol, sometimes called ship's grog, to sanitize their mouths or lift their spirits. Rum and beer were often their only comfort, but even those could be contaminated with mold or bacteria, if not brewed or stored properly. Shockingly, sailors learned that adding certain herbs or spices could mask some of the foul flavors and even inhibit bacterial growth temporarily. Sometimes, sailors would chew on raw garlic or onions, natural antiseptics to stave off infections. But listen to this. On some ships, desperate men resorted to consuming starvation soup, a brew made from whatever bits of decayed vegetables, moldy bread, and leftover scraps they could scavenge. It tasted horrible, but it kept them alive, barely. The smell alone could make your eyes water. Imagine the taste of sour, rotten, salty mess, with bits of insect and mold swarming in every spoonful. That was the reality for sailors trying to survive another day. Now, as if contaminated water and rotten food weren't enough, sailors faced another terrifying problem: rats and lice. The ships were infested. Rodents gnawed at the supplies, spreading more disease, and lice burrowed into their clothes and beds, causing itching, sores, and even relapsing fever. The lice and rats weren't just nuisances, they were deadly. A rat bite could introduce bacteria directly into the bloodstream. Sailors learned to trap and kill these pests with crude devices, sometimes just a piece of wood or a bottle filled with water to drown the rats. Still, outbreaks persisted, and many sailors fell ill or died because of it. And it gets worse. Imagine the hygiene, or lack of it. Bathing was rare, sometimes only once every few months. The sea was their only shower, and even that was a rough rinse. As a result, sailors' skin was often greasy, covered in salt and grime, and their gums bleeding from scurvy. Their hair was thick with salt and sweat, tangled into dreadlocks, and their clothes, if they had any, were soaked in sweat, salt, and mold. It was a breeding ground for infection. Worse yet, infections like abscesses or infected wounds could quickly turn deadly without proper treatment. Medical knowledge was minimal. Many sailors relied on herbal remedies or simple poultices, often made from crushed herbs, salt, or even animal fats. And speaking of medicine, you might think they had hospitals at sea. Not quite. Sometimes sailors would carve out a small space on deck, what they called a makeshift hospital, where they'd tend to the sick with rudimentary tools, scalpels, leeches, poultices of herbs, and, sometimes surprisingly, wine or brandy to sterilize their instruments. With no antiseptics, infection often took its toll. Many sailors died from infected wounds or fevers. The pain was excruciating, their screams echoing across the waves while the ship sailed on, indifferent to their suffering. What about the crew itself? Well, the typical sailor was young, tough, but often malnourished and exhausted. They'd work in shifts, sometimes for weeks without proper rest. The mortality rate was staggering, up to 20% on some voyages. Many never saw land again, succumbing to the combined horrors of starvation, disease, or injuries. Their bodies, swollen and bloated from the decomposition inside the ship, would sometimes be tossed overboard in a grim ritual. Another day, another sailor lost to the sea. But don't forget, amid all this filth and suffering, sailors developed routines, ways to cope, to survive. They'd hide in the darkest corners of the ship when epidemics struck, avoiding the infected. They learned to recognize the signs of disease early: fever, cough, skin rashes, and took makeshift measures. Sometimes they'd even resort to superstitions, charms, prayers, or rituals intended to ward off illness. Cruel, but real. Today we have clean water, refrigeration, antibiotics, and sanitized ships. But back then, it was a constant fight against the elements, against microbes, against despair. Their sacrifices, their suffering, these stories are what made exploration, colonization, and global trade possible. They faced horrors that most of us can't even imagine, all for the promise of new lands, riches, or simply survival. So, next time you sip clean water or enjoy a hearty meal, think about the brave souls who centuries ago fought to stay alive in the filth, the sickness, and the chaos of the open sea. Their struggles shaped the world we live in today. Trust me, understanding their suffering makes our modern comforts feel all the more precious. And if you want to dive even deeper into the grossest, most unbelievable aspects of colonial sailors' lives, like the 12 disgusting drinks they consume just to get by, there's more I can tell you. Stay tuned, because this story isn't over yet. Imagine yourself standing on the deck of a creaking ship, hundreds of miles from land. The salty air bites at your skin, sharp as a knife, and every breath tastes like seawater and despair. The crew around you is exhausted, their faces gaunt, eyes sunken. They're seasick, feverish, and some are already slipping into delirium. You can hear the groans of the ship, a cruel symphony of wood straining against the endless salt and wind. But today we're not here to talk the voyage itself. No, we're diving into something even more disgusting. Those terrible, mind-boggling drinks sailors consumed just to survive the hell of colonial navigation. You see, back then, sailors faced more than storms and scurvy. They battled a relentless, disgusting menu of homemade, often deadly concoctions. And it wasn't just about staying hydrated. It was about fighting off the sickness and boredom, trying to stave off the madness that lurked behind every creak of the mast. But honestly, some of these drinks would make your stomach turn just hearing about them. Let's start with the most infamous, fire water. Not the smooth whiskey we know today, but a dark, oily brew made from rotten ingredients, sometimes fermented from spoiled rice or moldy bread. The smell alone could knock you over. Imagine a boiling pot of decomposing grains, the stench cutting through the salty breeze. These drinks often had a bitter, acrid taste, like licking a burnt piece of wood. Yet sailors drank it. Desperation was a potent flavor. Some believed it kept them warm, but most just got drunk faster, rendering them more vulnerable to injury or disease. But it gets worse. How about ship's grog? How about not the standard liquor mixed with water, but a foul blend of rum, seawater, and whatever else floated into the barrel? Imagine taking a sip and tasting the salty, bitter tang of the ocean itself. And sailors, on those long, hungry voyages, often added whatever they could find: leaves, moldy citrus, peels, sometimes even fishy bits. They'd mix in salt water to stretch their supplies, which meant the drink was more salt than liquid. It coated their throats with a gritty, viscous film, and the alcohol masked the taste of rot. I kid you not, some sailors joked that drinking ship's grog was like swallowing a piece of the sea itself. Now you might think that's enough horror for one drink, but no. There was the Hugh Tanglefoot, a thick, syrupy brew made from boiled sugar, moldy bread, and unwashed water. It looked like molasses, sticky and dark. The smell? Imagine rotten eggs mixed with burnt rubber. It clung to your nostrils, making you gag. Yet sailors downed it because it was cheap, plentiful, and sometimes the only thing they had. They'd chew on sugar cubes or dry bread afterward, trying to wash down the nastiness. The physical toll was brutal: stomach pains, vomiting, and sometimes hallucinations from poisoning. And then there were the kauskin swill kamati, a collection of whatever was left in the bilge, fermented with leftover scraps of food and mold. It was a black, viscous sludge that reeked of decay, and sailors would take tiny sips, hoping to stave off dehydration, but sometimes they'd gulp it down in desperation, risking infection or worse. The taste was so terrible that many sailors would vomit immediately, only to gulp it down again a few minutes later. Their guts must have felt like a battlefield, torn between survival and sickness. Eager for variety, sailors also resorted to brine, a salty, sour liquid made from seawater and spoiled vegetables. They'd try to mask the salty, bitter flavor with dangerous spirits or sweet syrups, if they had any. But mostly, they just drank it, knowing full well it was poison. That constant salt in their stomachs, their insides inflamed, their guts shriveled, was a slow, agonizing torture. The dehydration, combined with alcohol and spoiled drinks, often led to delirium, trembling, and bleeding gums. Speaking of bleeding, some sailors drank whiskey wash, a concoction of cheap spirits and leftover wine, sometimes contaminated with mold or bacterial growth. The taste? Like sour vinegar mixed with burnt rubber. The effects? A fog that dulled pain, but often masked serious injuries or illnesses. Cruelly, some sailors believed it kept them warm in the icy Atlantic, when in reality it just dulled their senses enough for them not to notice their worsening health. Now you might wonder, how did they manage to survive drinking such filth? Well, survival wasn't just about water. No, it was about resilience, mental and physical. Sailors learned to endure, to tolerate, to find small routines amid chaos. Sometimes they'd add bits of citrus or vinegar to mask the flavor, but these were rare luxuries. Often they just drank, because they knew deep down that dehydration or infection would kill them faster than any poison. And here's the thing, these drinks weren't just about flavor or nutrition. They became part of the sailors' psychological armor. Drinking was often a ritual, sometimes a desperate attempt to forget the torment or to rally courage before facing yet another storm or illness. But cruel as it was, those drinks also left scars. Their stomachs damaged beyond recognition, their minds dulled, their bodies weakened. Many sailors carried the physical and emotional trauma for the rest of their lives. Think about the mental strength required to keep going, knowing that every sip could be your last, that they faced not only the sea and storms, but also the filth that could kill from within. Imagine the horror of a sailor with bleeding gums, trembling, eyes cloudy, knowing that their only relief was another swallow of this deadly sludge. That's resilience on a brutal human scale. Fast forward to today. Thank goodness we have clean water, refrigeration, antibiotics, and sanitation. We don't have to drink moldy, salty sludge to survive. Our sailors and everyone's lives are safer now because of those brave, suffering souls of centuries past. Their sacrifices, their resilience, these stories remind us of how far we've come. Without their suffering, our modern comforts might never have existed. So next time you sip a glass of clean water or enjoy a warm meal, think about those sailors. Think of the filth they drank, the diseases they fought off, and the strength it took to keep going. Their courage, hidden behind tales of horror, shaped the world as we know it. They endured what most of us can't even imagine. And that, my friend, is the true legacy of those brave souls sailing into the unknown, fueled by drinks so vile they defy belief. If you want to know even more disgusting, unbelievable stories from their voyages, the bugs, the rotting food, the infections, just hit like, subscribe, and stay tuned. Because the more you understand their suffering, the more you appreciate the modern world we live in today. And trust me, the courage of those anonymous sailors is a story worth telling, one of human resilience that continues to inspire us.